There is a small shift happening in your body right now, so small you probably haven't noticed it until this very sentence pointed it out. Somewhere in the back of your neck, or along your upper arms, or across your shoulder blades, there's a low-level readiness humming along, a kind of quiet sentry duty your nervous system performs without asking your permission. It has been doing this since before you were born, and it will keep doing it long after you've forgotten this recording exists. Tonight, we're going to slow that process down until it makes sense, until the strange little shiver of feeling watched becomes something ordinary and almost comforting, the way a creaky house stops sounding haunted once you know it's just the wood settling. Let's start with the feeling itself, because it deserves to be named gently before we start taking it apart. You're somewhere quiet, maybe a library, maybe an empty parking lot at dusk, maybe just your own living room with the lights low, and out of nowhere your skin seems to know something before your mind does. Your shoulders draw in slightly. Your breath catches for half a second. There's a pull, almost like a string tied loosely from the base of your skull to some point in the room you haven't consciously located yet, and when you finally turn, sometimes there's someone there, and sometimes there isn't. Either way, the sensation felt real. It felt specific. It felt like information arriving from somewhere, even if you couldn't say exactly where. This feeling has a name in psychology, though it's less exotic than you might expect. Researchers often call it the sense of being stared at, and it's been studied on and off for more than a century, which is itself a little surprising. You'd think something this universal, this old, would have a tidy scientific explanation locked down decades ago. Instead, it's one of those experiences that sits right at the boundary between things we understand fairly well and things we're still puzzling over, which is part of what makes it such a good subject for a night like this. There's no need to rush toward a single tidy answer. We can wander through the actual research the way you might wander through a house at night with a small flashlight, pausing wherever something catches the light. Before we go any further, it helps to set one thing down gently, like a heavy bag you've been carrying without noticing. This feeling, however uncanny it seems in the moment, is not evidence of anything paranormal. That's not a dismissal, and it's not meant to take the wonder out of it. It's simply where the honest evidence points, and honestly, the real explanation turns out to be just as interesting as any supernatural one, maybe more so, because it's happening inside your own remarkable body every single day, whether or not anyone is actually looking at you. Think for a moment about how much of your perception happens below the surface of your attention. You're not consciously monitoring your heartbeat right now, and yet if it skipped, you'd know instantly. You're not deliberately tracking the temperature of the room, and yet if a window opened somewhere down the hall, you might feel the change in the air against your cheek before you could explain why you noticed it at all. Human perception is layered like sediment, with the vast majority of it running quietly underneath, processing sound, light, air pressure, tiny motions at the edge of vision, and only occasionally sending a memo up to the part of you that thinks in words and forms opinions. Feeling watched seems to live in exactly that gap between the sediment and the surface, between all the noticing your body does automatically and the little bit of it that finally taps you on the shoulder and says, "Something is happening here." Consider your peripheral vision for a moment, since it plays a much bigger role in this story than most people assume. The edges of your visual field are built differently than the center, where your central vision is sharp and detailed, made for reading a page or recognizing a face. Your peripheral vision is tuned instead for motion and change,
For catching a flicker of movement, a hunter or a hunted creature might need to notice, long before there was time to look directly at it. This is old machinery, older than language, older than clothing, shaped across a very long stretch of time, when noticing movement half a second sooner than the next creature could matter enormously. Even now, sitting somewhere safe and warm, that machinery is still running in the background of your skull, scanning the edges of the room, the way a lighthouse beam sweeps a harbor, not because anything is wrong, but because that's simply what it was built to do.
So imagine someone enters a room and settles at the far edge of your peripheral vision, at a distance where you couldn't identify them by name, where you might not even be able to say with confidence whether they're facing toward you or away. Your central vision, busy with whatever you're actually looking at, doesn't register them consciously. But your peripheral vision, that old motion-sensitive machinery, absolutely does. It picks up the shift in shape, the small movements of breathing, the subtle turn of a head, and it forwards a kind of unlabeled alert further into your brain. Not a picture, not a sentence, just a nudge, a sense that something in the environment has changed and deserves attention, please, sometime soon. That nudge is often the very first thread of the feeling of being watched, arriving well before you have any words for it, sometimes even before you consciously know anyone else is in the room at all. There's a lovely, very human detail buried inside this that's worth pausing on. For most of history, people didn't have the vocabulary of neurons and visual fields that we have now, and yet they clearly recognized this exact experience, because they built words and customs around it in every culture we know of. Old folk expressions about the back of the neck prickling, about eyes boring into you from behind, about a chill running down the spine, show up again and again across languages that never touched each other, describing the same bodily sensation with strikingly similar imagery. That kind of convergence usually means something real and shared is going on in the human body, something worth explaining rather than explaining away. Alongside your visual system, your ears are quietly contributing to this feeling too, and they're arguably even better suited for it, since they never fully switch off, not even while you sleep. A shift in someone's stance, the soft compression of fabric as an arm crosses a chest, the faint change in air movement when a door eases open a few inches, all of these produce sounds so quiet you'd swear, if asked directly, that you heard nothing at all. And yet, your auditory system, remarkably sensitive and always listening, even when your attention is elsewhere, can register these tiny signals and pass them along as a feeling rather than a clear thought, because that's often how deep brain processing surfaces, not as neat sentences, but as a mood, a hunch, a slight unease that has no obvious source you could point to. What's happening, then, is less like a mysterious sixth sense and more like a very ordinary kind of teamwork, several different senses each contributing a fragment of ambiguous information, sound, peripheral motion, faint shifts in air pressure or light, none of it loud enough on its own to reach full conscious awareness, but together forming a pattern your brain finds worth flagging. That flag doesn't arrive as a labeled report. It arrives as sensation, as a prickle on the back of the neck, as a held breath, and it's genuinely difficult, sometimes impossible, to consciously untangle it back into its separate parts. You just feel it, whole and immediate, the way you feel hunger before you can name it,
as low blood sugar, or the way you feel tired before you consciously register how late it's gotten.
There's a comforting symmetry hidden in all of this, if you sit with it for a moment. The very same nervous system that once needed to detect a predator moving in tall grass, faster than conscious thought could manage, is the very same nervous system quietly at work in you tonight, still scanning, still weighing faint signals, still occasionally sending up a soft, wordless alert. Feeling watched isn't a glitch in your perception. It's closer to a signature of it, a small, everyday reminder of just how much sensing your body does without ever asking your permission first, and how much of that sensing was shaped across an extraordinarily long stretch of time before any of us were here to notice it happening. For now, let that be enough. This simple, sturdy idea that your body is built to sense far more than your conscious mind ever gets credit for. In a little while, we'll follow this thread further into the specific mechanics of exactly how much of your visual field truly falls outside conscious awareness, and just how much information can slip in through the edges without ever announcing itself directly. Let's slow down and look more closely at what people actually mean when they say, "I felt like someone was watching me." It sounds like one experience, a single unified feeling, but if you take it apart gently, the way you might unfold a paper flower to see how it was folded, you find several distinct experiences bundled together under that one phrase. They usually arrive close together in time, sometimes so close they seem simultaneous, and that closeness is part of why they feel like one thing rather than several. But they are not one thing. They are at least four, and understanding them separately makes the whole experience a little less mysterious and, I think, a little easier to rest with. The first is the most physical of the four, and often the fastest. It is a sudden bodily alert, something your body does before your mind has said a single word about it. A tightening at the back of the scalp, a small drop in the stomach, similar to missing a stair in the dark. Sometimes it's breath, held without any decision to hold it, or a shoulder that rises slightly, as though bracing for contact that hasn't happened and may never happen. This is your autonomic nervous system responding, the same broad system that quickens your pulse before you consciously register a loud noise, or that makes your hand pull back from a hot stove a fraction of a second before the thought, "That's hot," has fully formed. It is old machinery, older than language, running its own quiet analysis in parallel with whatever you happen to be thinking about. And it doesn't wait for permission. It reports first and lets the rest of the mind catch up afterward, which is part of why the sensation of being watched so often feels like it came from nowhere. In a sense, it did come from nowhere you had access to yet. The second is a thought, and this one arrives with actual content, words or something close to words. Someone is watching me. There's someone behind me. This part feels different from the bodily jolt because it has a subject and a claim, something that could, in principle, be true or false. It's the mind trying to make sense of that wordless alert, trying to give it a shape and a story, because minds are relentless storytellers, uncomfortable leaving a raw sensation just sitting there unexplained. You feel the prickle, and almost instantly, often within a fraction of a second, your mind supplies a sentence to go with it. This is worth noticing, because the thought and the bodily sensation are not the same event, even though they feel fused together. The sensation is data,
The thought is interpretation, and interpretations, however quickly they arrive, are not always accurate, even when the underlying data that produced them was perfectly real. The third strand is quieter and easier to miss entirely, because it usually isn't a distinct feeling so much as a background hum of information you were never fully paying attention to in the first place. This is peripheral awareness, and it deserves some patience here because it does a great deal of unglamorous work. Your eyes are gathering visual information across a much wider span than the narrow area you consciously look at. Think of the difference between reading a single word on a page and knowing, without looking directly, that there's a lamp somewhere off to your left. You didn't study the lamp. You didn't decide to notice it, but some rough sketch of its shape, its brightness, maybe even a sense of whether it moved recently, has been quietly logged by a part of your visual system that never bothers reporting to your conscious attention unless something changes. A shift in that peripheral picture, a shape that wasn't there a moment ago, a patch of light that dims slightly because something now stands between you and it, can register as significant before you ever consciously look toward it. You don't see it, exactly, not in the way you'd describe seeing something. You register that something in the visual field has changed, and that registration alone can be enough to produce unease, the third ingredient in the felt sense of being watched, distinct from both the bodily alert and the interpretive thought, though closely tangled with both. And then there is a fourth piece, one that belongs to a completely different category, because it isn't a sensation or an interpretation at all. It's a memory, formed after the fact, of a time the feeling turned out to be accurate. You felt uneasy, you turned around, and there, in fact, was someone looking directly at you. That moment is vivid. It's the kind of small experience that gets replayed, told to a friend over coffee, filed away as evidence. And it's genuinely worth taking seriously, because sometimes the feeling is accurate, built from real signals your senses picked up before your conscious mind did. But it's worth noticing something about memory here too. We tend to remember the times the feeling was confirmed far more vividly than the many, far more frequent times it wasn't. The times you turned around to an empty room, or to someone simply glancing past you on their way to somewhere else, not watching you at all. Nobody tells that story at dinner. There's no punchline in an empty hallway, so the confirmed cases pile up in memory, while the unconfirmed ones quietly evaporate. And over years, this can leave a person with the impression that the feeling is far more reliable than it actually is, statistically speaking. That's not a criticism of your perception. It's simply how memory works for all of us, weighting the dramatic over the ordinary, the resolved over the ambiguous. So when someone says, "I felt like I was being watched," what they usually mean, whether they've ever broken it down this way or not, is some blend of these four things. A bodily jolt that arrived first, and without explanation. A thought that quickly followed, to give that jolt a name. A thin thread of peripheral visual information that had already registered a change before conscious attention caught up. And, sometimes, layered on top of all of it, the residue of past experiences, where turning around confirmed the feeling and made it feel earned, reliable, almost proven.
4 different processes, 4 different time scales, compressed by the mind into something that feels instantaneous and singular. a seamless certainty, rather than the layered, somewhat improvised construction it actually is. There's something almost architectural about this, if you picture it. Imagine a house where 4 different alarm systems are wired into one single bell: a motion sensor by the window, a pressure pad under the doormat, a smoke detector in the hallway, a simple timer that rings every so often just to check the batteries. All 4 ring the same bell. From inside the house, all you hear is the bell. You don't automatically know which sensor triggered it, only that something, somewhere, seemed worth flagging. Untangling which system rang requires stepping back and checking each one individually, which is essentially what we've just done with the feeling of being watched, walking room to room, sensor to sensor, so that the single bell stops feeling quite so mysterious. None of this makes the feeling less real. The bodily jolt is real, a genuine physiological event with measurable characteristics, a small surge of arousal in the nervous system. The thought is real too, a real cognitive event, even if the claim it makes turns out, on any particular occasion, to be mistaken. The peripheral information is real, gathered by real photoreceptors doing their quiet, tireless work along the edges of your vision, and the memory of the times you turned around and found someone there, that's real as well, an accurate record of an event that actually happened, even if it isn't representative of every time the feeling occurred. What changes, once you separate these 4 threads, isn't whether the experience happened, it's simply how you hold it afterward, with a little more curiosity and a little less unease, understanding it as a handful of ordinary processes working together rather than as a single, unexplainable certainty. And once you can see the 4 threads clearly, a natural next question starts to form, quiet and unhurried, the kind of question that doesn't need answering right this moment, but sits pleasantly at the edge of the mind. Just how much is that peripheral system really taking in, all the time, without ever telling you directly? That's where we'll drift next, into the wide, dim edges of your own vision, and just how much of the world quietly lives there. Let's set the peripheral vision question gently to one side for a moment, because before we go looking at what the eyes are doing, it helps to understand why any of this machinery exists in the first place. Why would a nervous system bother building a whole detection network for something as vague as a feeling? Why not just wait for solid evidence before reacting at all? The answer takes us a long way back. Long before doormats and hallway smoke detectors, long before houses at all, to a much older and much plainer kind of night. Picture an early human, somewhere on an open grassland, tens of thousands of years ago, settling down near a small fire as the light fails. There's no lock on any door, because there is no door. There's a rustle in the grass a short distance away, and in that single, ordinary moment, the mind faces a small but genuinely consequential decision. Is that sound a predator, or is it only wind moving through dry stalks? There isn't time to gather more evidence, no chance to walk over calmly and check. A choice, of some kind, has to be made almost instantly, and the 2 possible mistakes are not equally costly, not even close. Think for a moment about what each kind of mistake would actually cost. If our early human treats the rustle as nothing, settles back down, and it turns out to have been a predator after all, the outcome can be the end of that person's story, and depending on the circumstances, perhaps the end of a family's story too. But if that same person treats the rustle as a threat, tenses, glances over, maybe even gets up to check, and it turns out to have been nothing more than wind, the cost is small. A little wasted energy, a brief interruption to an otherwise calm evening, some mild embarrassment if anyone else happened to be watching. Nothing close to catastrophic. This lopsided arrangement, where one kind of error is mild and reversible, and the other kind of error can be fatal and permanent, is the quiet engine behind a great deal of what feels, on the surface, like unnecessary jumpiness. It isn't unnecessary at all, not when you look at it this way. It's closer to a form of arithmetic, run without any conscious counting, weighing a small guaranteed cost against a small chance of an enormous one, and across enormous stretches of time, brains that ran this arithmetic well, that leaned toward caution when the stakes were uneven, tended to have more chances to pass whatever traits shaped that leaning on to the next generation. Brains that didn't lean that way, that waited for certainty before reacting, sometimes didn't get another evening to reconsider. This is often described using a simple piece of vocabulary borrowed from decision theory, the idea of a false positive and a false negative. A false positive is when the system rings the bell and there's nothing there, mistaking wind for a predator, mistaking an empty room for an occupied one. A false negative is the opposite mistake, when the system stays quiet and there actually was something there, missing a real predator, missing a real watching gaze. Any detection system, whether it's a smoke alarm, a medical test, or a nervous system tuned by a very long evolutionary history, has to find some balance point between these two kinds of error, because in the real world, avoiding one kind of mistake completely usually means becoming much more prone to the other. Consider the smoke detector again for a moment, since it makes the trade-off easy to picture. You could build one so insensitive that it never once goes off from burnt toast, never gets triggered by steam from a hot shower, never sounds an alarm over nothing. But to achieve that, you'd very likely have to make it less sensitive to real smoke too, and that's a dangerous trade to make, because the cost of a missed fire is nothing like the cost of a false alarm. So instead, the detectors installed in most homes are built to err in the other direction, tolerating a certain number of unnecessary beeps in exchange for a much smaller chance of missing an actual fire. Nobody designing those devices considers the occasional burnt toast alarm to be a flaw in the system. It's closer to a deliberate feature, a sign that the sensitivity has been tuned correctly for what's actually at stake. The feeling of being watched seems to work on something like the same tuning. Across a long evolutionary history, the ancestors who were around long enough to have descendants weren't necessarily the ones who were right every single time about whether they were being watched. They were the ones whose systems erred, when they had to err at all, on the side of noticing too much rather than too little. A nervous system willing to be wrong sometimes, willing to make you turn around toward an empty room now and then, was, on balance, a safer nervous system to inherit than one that waited patiently for certainty and occasionally paid for that patience with everything. It's worth pausing on the word predator for a moment, because the pressures that shaped this wariness weren't only about large animals with teeth. For social creatures like early humans, other people mattered enormously to survival too, in both directions. Being watched by the wrong person, a rival, a stranger with uncertain intentions, could matter just as much as being watched by an animal in the grass. But being watched by the right person, someone who might help, cooperate, or simply notice you were there, mattered as well. So this detection system likely wasn't tuned only toward danger in the narrow sense. It was tuned toward social relevance more broadly, toward the general question of whether another mind might currently be paying attention to yours,
because that question, answered well, shaped countless outcomes across a long evolutionary history, from safety to alliance to reputation among a small, close group of people who depended on each other. There's a related idea worth sitting with quietly here, sometimes called the smoke detector principle, borrowed from an idea proposed by the researcher Randolph Nesse. The name fits so naturally it barely needs adjusting. Nesse's observation was that many of the body's alarm systems, whether they produce anxiety, nausea, pain, or a felt sense of being observed, are built to sound off well before there's any certainty of real danger, because the evolutionary cost of a slightly overactive alarm is so much smaller than the cost of alarm that stays silent when it shouldn't.
This idea remains a topic of ongoing discussion among researchers, refined and debated in different ways, but the core shape of it lines up neatly with what we've already walked through, room by room, sensor by sensor. None of this means every instance of the feeling traces back to some ancient encounter with a predator in tall grass. That would be far too tidy a story for something as layered as human experience. What it does mean is that the underlying architecture, the tendency to notice, to flag, to lean toward caution rather than certainty, likely didn't appear in modern humans at random. It was shaped, gradually and unevenly, by circumstances where the two kinds of mistakes carried very different weights, and where leaning toward the milder mistake, again and again, over countless individual lives, ended up mattering more than not making mistakes at all. It also helps explain something a little curious about how the feeling tends to arrive. It rarely comes with a full explanation attached. It doesn't usually announce itself as, there is a specific person in the doorway looking directly at you. More often, it arrives as something vaguer and more urgent, a simple pull toward attention, a small tug that says, look now, sort out the details later. That ordering, react first, explain after, makes very little sense if the goal is calm accuracy, but it makes a great deal of sense if the goal, shaped over a long stretch of evolutionary time, is simply not getting caught by surprise. Speed mattered more than precision, because a slightly wrong but fast response to a real threat beats a perfectly accurate but slow one nearly every time it counts. So the jumpiness isn't a flaw in the design, or a mind being irrational for no reason. It's closer to a very old, very patient kind of engineering, tuned across an almost unimaginable number of small moments, each one a tiny wager between a mild cost and a severe one. And once that tuning is in place, quietly humming along in the background of an ordinary evening, it doesn't really care whether the doorway in question opens onto an ancient grassland or a modern hallway with the lights off. It just keeps watching, the way it always has, waiting to see whether that quiet, dim edge of vision has anything worth mentioning. Let's stay with that dim edge of vision for a while, because it's doing far more work than most people ever give it credit for. Peripheral vision is strange stuff. It's not a lesser version of the sharp, detailed sight you use to read a page or recognize a face. It's a different system almost entirely, built for a different job. The center of your visual field, the part lined with densely packed cone cells, is built for detail, for color, for reading the expression on someone's face from across a room. The edges of your visual field are built for something older and blunter, movement, contrast, change. They're tuned to notice when something in a mostly still scene stops being still. And critically, they can do this without you ever consciously looking at whatever it is that moved. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it explains a lot about that itchy, unplaceable sense of being observed. You can be fully absorbed in a book, eyes tracking left to right across a page, and somewhere off to the side, well outside the zone you'd call your focus, a shape shifts. Maybe a curtain sways. Maybe someone's arm drops to their side after being raised. Maybe nothing dramatic happens at all, just a small change in the pattern of light and shadow near a doorway. Your central vision never touches it. You don't turn your head, and yet something registers. Somewhere in the visual processing that happens before information ever reaches the parts of the brain responsible for naming things, a flag gets raised. Change detected. Not identified, not confirmed, just detected, and passed along as a faint pressure toward attention. That pressure is often exactly what people describe when they say they felt eyes on them before they saw anyone. It isn't mystical. It's closer to a smoke detector than a psychic. Smoke detectors don't know what's burning. They don't distinguish between a candle and a real fire. They just respond to a particular kind of particle in the air and make noise. Peripheral vision works a little like that with movement. It responds to the fact of change, not the meaning of it, and lets the rest of the mind sort out later whether the change matters. Head and body orientation add another layer to this. Human beings, like most animals with forward-facing eyes, are remarkably good at reading where another creature's attention is pointed, and we do it almost entirely without meaning to. It isn't only the eyes that give this away, though the eyes matter enormously, which we'll come back to. It's the angle of the shoulders. It's the tilt of the head. It's the very small rotation of a torso that happens when someone shifts their weight to face a new direction. None of these are subtle signals if you consciously study them, but the interesting part is that you don't have to study them. Human visual processing seems to extract this kind of orientation information rapidly and without effort, the way you don't have to think hard to tell that a person walking toward you is walking toward you rather than away. So when someone enters a room behind you, even if you never turn around, there can be second-hand cues available. A slight change in the quality of light if they pass in front of a lamp. The particular rhythm of footsteps that differs from the footsteps of someone simply passing through, footsteps that hesitate, or slow, or stop altogether in a spot that isn't a natural stopping place. Footsteps carry more information than people usually notice. A person walking with purpose toward a destination sounds different from a person who has paused to look at something. The rhythm breaks. There's a small silence where sound should be. And human hearing, which evolved long before human reading or human writing, is extremely sensitive to exactly that kind of break in an expected pattern. A missing footstep can be as informative as an added one. Then there's the matter of eye whites, which is a small anatomical detail that turns out to carry an outsized amount of behavioral weight. Human eyes are unusual among primates. Most other primates have darkly pigmented sclera, the part of the eye surrounding the iris, which makes it hard to tell at a glance exactly where their eyes are pointed. Human sclera, by contrast, tends to be pale, often strikingly white, which makes the direction of gaze far easier to read from a distance and even from an angle. There are different ideas about why this evolved the way it did, and reasonable disagreement about which explanation matters most, but one idea that gets discussed fairly often is that visible sclera may have made it easier for early humans to coordinate by eye contact alone,
to silently indicate danger or direction or intention in situations where speaking aloud would have been risky or simply impractical.
Whether or not that's the whole story, the practical result is the same either way. Human gaze direction is unusually easy to detect, which means that on the flip side, human beings are also unusually good at detecting when someone else's gaze is directed at them, sometimes from surprising distances, sometimes from angles that don't feel like they should allow for it. This is part of why reflections and shadows play such a strange trick on the sense of being watched. A reflection in a dark window at night can show a rough approximation of a face, or the pale patch where sclera would be, without any of the fine detail that would let the conscious mind confirm what it's looking at. The visual system, tuned to flag anything resembling eyes, can respond to that rough approximation before slower, more careful processing steps in to say, wait, that's just the window, that's just my own reflection, there's no one there. In the gap between the fast flag and the slow correction, the feeling of being watched can bloom, fully formed, complete with a small jolt of unease, even though nothing was ever actually watching at all. Shadows work in a related way. A shadow that happens to fall in roughly the shape of a person, especially one that shifts slightly as a light source moves or as branches sway outside a window, can trigger the same rough pattern match. Two dark patches close together, roughly eye-shaped, roughly eye-spaced, is sometimes all it takes. None of this requires anything to actually be there. It only requires the brain's pattern matching systems, which are fast, generous, and none too fussy about exact detail, to notice something that vaguely resembles a face or a gaze before slower systems get a chance to check the work. Airflow deserves a mention too, because it's one of those cues that almost never gets consciously noticed, yet can shift the whole feeling of a room. A door left slightly open changes the air pressure and temperature of a space in small, measurable ways. So does another person's presence nearby, their breath, their body heat, the way they block or redirect a draft that had been moving steadily before. Skin is extraordinarily sensitive to tiny shifts in temperature and air movement, more sensitive, in some ways, than most people give it credit for. A very faint change in the air on the back of the neck, too small to name, can still register as a kind of wrongness, a sense that the room isn't quite the way it was a moment ago, even if nothing about the room can be pointed to directly as the cause. And then there's silence itself, which sounds like an absence, but often behaves like a signal. A house has a baseline hum, appliances cycling on and off, distant traffic, the creak of a settling structure, the small ongoing noise of the world going about its business. When part of that baseline disappears, when a floorboard that usually creaks under someone's weight suddenly doesn't, or a hallway that usually carries faint sound from another room goes quiet, the brain notices the gap the same way it notices an unexpected sound. Silence in the wrong place can be just as informative, just as flag-raising, as noise in the wrong place. It suggests, without ever stating outright, that something nearby is being deliberately still, and stillness that has to be deliberate is not the same as an empty room. Taken together, these small clues, the sideways flicker of motion, the angle of shoulders, the particular rhythm of a footstep or its absence, the pale flash of sclera in low light, a shadow shaped almost like a face, a shift in airflow, a pocket of unusual quiet, form a kind of quiet chorus running underneath ordinary awareness. Each one on its own might mean nothing at all,
But the mind doesn't wait for certainty before it responds. It gathers fragments, weighs them loosely against each other, and if enough of them lean the same direction, it produces that familiar, wordless nudge. Something here deserves your attention, even before you know quite what that something is.
Now, if all of those fragments really do add up to something, there has to be a place in the brain where the adding happens. Not a single switch, but a loose network of regions that specialize, each in its own quiet way, in figuring out where another creature's attention is pointed. And one of the more interesting members of that network sits along a fold of tissue with a name that sounds almost architectural: the superior temporal sulcus. Sulcus simply means a groove, one of the many valleys folded into the surface of the brain, and this particular groove runs along the side of the head, roughly above and behind the ear, tracing a path between the temporal lobe below and the parietal lobe above. You don't need to memorize where it is. It helps only to know that it exists, tucked into the brain's landscape, like a narrow canyon, and that cells living along its walls appear to care, more than almost any other cells in the brain, about where eyes are looking. Researchers first became curious about this region through a slow accumulation of small, careful observations, the kind of science that rarely makes headlines because no single study is dramatic on its own. Some of the earliest relevant work came from studies of monkeys in the late 20th century, where scientists recording from individual neurons noticed something curious. Certain cells would fire, would become active, specifically when the monkey saw another face looking directly at it, and would quiet down, or fire differently when that same face looked away, even though the face itself hadn't changed at all. Same nose, same mouth, same familiar arrangement of features. Only the direction of the eyes had shifted, and the neuron seemed to care enormously about that one variable. Later work in humans, using different tools entirely, brain imaging that tracks blood flow as a rough proxy for neural activity, found a similar pattern in and around this same groove. Watching a gaze shift toward you tended to light this region up in ways that watching a gaze shift away did not, or watching an object move without any eyes attached to it at all did not. It's worth pausing on how strange that is, if you let yourself sit with it. Somewhere in the folds of your brain, there are populations of cells that behave, in a simplified sense, like a specialized gaze detector, tuned less to faces in general and more to the specific question of where a face's attention is aimed. Not who is this person, which is a different puzzle, handled by different, though overlapping, machinery. Not what expression are they making, which recruits yet another set of regions. Just, in effect, is this pointed at me? It's a narrow question, almost absurdly narrow when you say it plainly, and yet it seems to matter enough, evolutionarily, that dedicated tissue evolved to keep asking it, over and over, many times a second, without you ever noticing the asking. That's a simplified way of describing it, worth naming as simplified, because the truth underneath is messier and still being worked out. The superior temporal sulcus doesn't work alone, and it isn't a single, tidy gaze-detecting module sitting in isolation. It's more like one especially active member of a small committee, a region that talks constantly to its neighbors, feeding information forward and receiving information back, so that gaze direction is less a fact discovered in one place and more a conclusion reached through conversation between several places at once. Scientists still argue, in the careful, hedging way that good scientists argue, about exactly how much this region does on its own versus how much it borrows from elsewhere. But the general shape of the finding, that something in this fold of tissue cares disproportionately about the direction of another creature's eyes, has held up reasonably well across many different kinds of studies, which is about as much confidence as brain science tends to offer on any single point. One of the places this region seems to be in conversation with is a small, almond-shaped structure buried deep in the middle of the brain, on each side, called the amygdala. The name comes from the Latin word for almond, chosen simply because of its shape, nothing more poetic than that, though it has taken on an almost mythic reputation in popular writing about the brain, often described, a little too simply, as the brain's fear center. That description isn't quite fair to what the amygdala actually does, which is broader and more nuanced, involved in emotional weighting of many kinds, not fear alone. But it is fair to say that the amygdala pays close attention to anything that might carry emotional significance, and that a face looking directly at you, especially an unfamiliar face, especially one whose expression is hard to read, qualifies as exactly that kind of significant thing. There's a reason a direct gaze tends to activate this deeper structure more than an averted one does, and it likely has to do with what a direct gaze has meant across a very long evolutionary history for creatures like us. Among many social animals, sustained direct eye contact is not neutral. It can be a threat display, a challenge, a signal of aggression, depending on the species and the context. It can also be a bid for connection, an invitation, depending on who's doing it and how. The ambiguity itself is part of what makes it charged. A gaze holds information, but it doesn't hold a fixed meaning, and brains that evolved in social groups seem to have been shaped to treat that ambiguity as worth extra processing, worth flagging for a deeper structure to weigh in on, rather than letting it pass by as unremarkable. So you can imagine, again in simplified form, a kind of relay. The superior temporal sulcus and its neighbors do the work of figuring out that a gaze is pointed toward you in the first place, sorting through the visual scene for that narrow, specific pattern. And once that determination is made, or even while it's still being made, the amygdala gets looped in, adding a layer of emotional charge, of significance, of this might matterness, to what would otherwise be a fairly dry geometric fact about the angle of someone's pupils. It's the difference between noticing that a line is pointed at you and feeling that a line is pointed at you, and that felt quality, that sense of weight, seems to depend heavily on this deeper structure doing its quiet, constant work of tagging incoming information as worth caring about. None of this happens in isolation from attention itself, which is its own complicated system, spread widely across the brain, rather than confined to any single region. There are networks, described in various models with various names, that seem to specialize in different flavors of attention. Some are more involved in deliberately, effortfully focusing on something you've chosen to focus on, the kind of attention you use when you're trying to read fine print in dim light. Others are more involved in the opposite, in being interrupted, in having your attention grabbed by something in the environment, whether you wanted it grabbed or not, the kind of attention a sudden movement in the corner of your vision claims for itself before you've consciously decided anything at all. It's this second kind, this bottom-up, interruption-prone kind of attention, that seems especially relevant to the feeling of being watched. A gaze detected by the superior temporal sulcus, flagged as significant by the amygdala, doesn't simply sit there as neutral information. It appears to recruit this reflexive attention system, pulling your focus toward the source almost against your will, the way a loud noise pulls your head around before you've had time to think about whether turning is a good idea. And once attention has been pulled, the body tends to follow,
because none of this stays contained inside the skull. The amygdala has connections running down into the parts of the nervous system that handle automatic, background bodily functions, the ones you don't consciously operate: heart rate, breathing rate, the faint dampness of the palms, the subtle redistribution of blood flow toward muscles that might need to move quickly. These are the same systems involved in what's often called the fight-or-flight response, though that phrase, too, is a simplification of something more graded and situational than a simple binary switch. A strongly detected gaze, one carrying enough weight and enough ambiguity, can nudge these systems just slightly, a small quickening, a faint prickle, well below the threshold of anything you'd call alarm, but enough to be felt as a kind of background hum of readiness. You might not be able to say your heart rate changed. You might only notice, in retrospect, that you felt unsettled, alert, tuned to a slightly higher pitch than a moment before, without any clear story for why. It's this whole cascade: gaze noticed, gaze weighted, attention pulled, body faintly readied, that likely underlies a good portion of what people describe as sensing a watcher before any conscious reasoning has caught up. The machinery runs quickly, and it runs beneath the level where you narrate your own thoughts to yourself. By the time you've formed the sentence, "I feel like someone's looking at me," several systems have already finished their work and handed the conclusion upward, fully formed, asking only to be noticed. Which raises a natural next question, one worth sitting with for a while. How much of that handed-up conclusion is reliable, and how much of it is the brain's own eagerness to find a pattern, whether or not one is really there?
Let's slow down for a moment and look more closely at eyes themselves, because there's something genuinely unusual about the human eye, something that doesn't show up quite the same way in most other animals, and it helps explain why gaze carries so much weight in the first place. If you compare a human eye to the eye of a chimpanzee, or a gorilla, or almost any other primate, you'll notice a difference that seems small until you think about what it means. The human eye has a large visible white area surrounding the colored iris, what's called the sclera, and in humans, that sclera is not just visible, but strikingly visible, pale and exposed, in a way that makes the direction of a person's gaze easy to read from a distance, even without seeing the rest of their face clearly. Most other primates have sclera that's darkly pigmented, closer in color to the iris itself, which has the effect of camouflaging where exactly they're looking. A chimpanzee can shift its eyes to the side, and unless you're close enough to catch the subtle movement, you might not register the change at all. A human doing the same thing is almost impossible to miss. There's a hypothesis, still discussed and still being tested in different ways, that this visible sclera developed because it served a communicative purpose, that being easy to read, rather than being a liability, became an advantage for a species that depended heavily on coordinating attention with other members of its group. Knowing where someone else was looking, quickly, and without needing them to speak or point, would have been useful for shared hunting, shared caution about predators, shared care of children, all the countless small moments where two people benefit from looking at the same thing at the same time. Other explanations exist too, and the picture is almost certainly more complicated than any single tidy story, but the underlying fact remains interesting regardless of which explanation turns out to be most accurate. Human eyes seem built, at least in part, to be looked at, to broadcast where attention is pointed, rather than to hide it. This matters for the sensation of being watched, because it means human gaze is unusually detectable, even at a distance, even in dim light, even in brief glances. A pale sclera surrounding a dark iris creates strong contrast, and contrast is exactly the kind of visual feature that draws the eye quickly, the same way a single dark mark on a white page pulls your attention before you've decided to look at it. So when someone across a room turns their head slightly and their gaze lands on you, your visual system doesn't need much information to register that shift. The contrast alone does a lot of the work, well before you've consciously identified whose eyes they are or what expression accompanies them. Now, infants are worth pausing on here, because they offer a kind of natural experiment in how early this sensitivity to gaze appears, long before language, long before most of what we'd call reasoning. Researchers studying infant attention have found, across a range of careful studies using eye-tracking equipment and simple preference tests, that babies just weeks old show a preference for faces with direct gaze over faces with averted gaze. Shown two nearly identical images, one where the eyes look straight ahead and one where they're turned to the side, infants will typically spend more time looking at the direct gaze image. This preference shows up remarkably early enough that it seems difficult to explain purely through learning, through weeks of accumulated experience about what direct gaze tends to mean. It looks, instead, like something closer to a built-in bias, a readiness to notice and prefer eyes that are looking back, present from very near the beginning of a person's life. This early sensitivity likely serves an obvious and rather tender purpose. A newborn depends entirely on caregivers noticing it, attending to it, meeting its gaze during feeding and holding and all the ordinary moments of care. Mutual gaze between infant and caregiver appears to play a role in early bonding, in the developing coordination between two nervous systems learning to read each other. When a mother or father looks into a baby's eyes and the baby looks back, something is happening that goes beyond simple visual tracking, something closer to a shared attentional loop being practiced and strengthened over and over in those early months. It's a small, quiet kind of communication, wordless entirely, built only from where two sets of eyes happen to be pointed. As people grow older, this sensitivity to gaze doesn't disappear, but it does become layered with much more, with social meaning, with cultural expectation, with all the learned rules about when eye contact is appropriate and when it isn't. In many cultures, sustained direct gaze between strangers can read as a challenge or as unusually intimate, and children are often taught, explicitly or by example, when to meet someone's eyes and when to look away out of politeness or deference. These learned rules vary considerably from place to place and from era to era, which is worth remembering because it means the deep biological readiness to notice gaze and the culturally shaped rules about what to do with that noticing are two different layers, running side by side, sometimes in agreement and sometimes in quiet tension. And there's a well-documented behavioral effect that shows how much this noticing can shape conduct even without a word being spoken. In a handful of interesting studies, researchers have found that people behave differently, often more cooperatively, more honestly, more generously, when there are eyes present in their environment, even when those eyes belong to nothing more than a photograph, or a simple drawing, or a pair of dots and a line suggesting a face. One well-known example involved an unattended coffee station in an office, where a small sign asked people to pay for what they took, on the honor system, into an open box. Researchers alternated the image above the sign, sometimes a photograph of eyes,
sometimes a photograph of flowers, and found, across many weeks, that people paid noticeably more when the eyes were watching than when the flowers were. Nobody was actually being observed. The photograph couldn't see anything, and yet something in the presence of those printed eyes was enough to shift behavior, quietly, without anyone necessarily noticing the influence at the time. This kind of effect has been studied in other settings too. Litter left on the ground, honesty in games involving money, even how carefully people follow posted rules. And while not every study finds the effect equally strongly, and researchers continue to debate how large or how reliable it really is, the general pattern points towards something worth sitting with. Human beings seem to carry, close to the surface, an old and easily triggered sense that being seen changes what's appropriate, changes how carefully we behave, changes the weight of our own choices. It doesn't take much to switch this sense on. Sometimes 2 dots and a curved line are enough. Other animals offer a different kind of comparison, and it's worth spending a little time here, because it shows both how widespread the response to a directed gaze is across the animal world, and how differently it can be expressed, depending on the species and its particular evolutionary history.
Many prey animals respond to a predator's direct gaze with heightened alertness or immediate flight, and this makes intuitive sense, since among most predators, being looked at directly and steadily often precedes an attack. A gazelle that notices a lion's eyes fixed on it, rather than the lion simply moving nearby, tends to react with more urgency, because a fixed predatory gaze carries specific meaning, a narrowing of attention that often comes just before a pursuit begins. Domestic dogs, interestingly, seem to have developed something closer to the human pattern, at least in their relationship with people. Dogs raised alongside humans often use eye contact to communicate intention, checking a person's face, following where a person's gaze is pointed, something that wolves, their close evolutionary relatives, do far less readily even when raised in similarly close contact with people. It's a difference that suggests eye contact, as a tool for connection rather than threat, may have been shaped in dogs, specifically through many thousands of years living alongside us. All of this begins to sketch a picture of gaze as something the nervous system takes very seriously, seriously enough to react to instantly, seriously enough to shape behavior even from a photograph, seriously enough to show up in infants before they can do much of anything else. Which brings us, naturally, to a stranger question tucked just behind all of this. If gaze is detected this quickly and weighted this heavily, what happens in the moments when there's no gaze at all to detect, no eyes actually present, and yet the feeling of being watched arrives anyway? This is exactly the question that led a handful of researchers, starting more than a century ago, to try something that sounds almost too simple. If people really can feel eyes on them even when there's nothing to see, why not test it directly? Put a person in a room, facing away, unable to see or hear anything. Put another person behind them, who either stares at the back of their neck or looks somewhere else entirely, according to a schedule the first person has no access to. Then, ask the first person, again and again, across many trials, to guess, watched or not watched. If the feeling is real, in the sense of tracking something in the world, rather than something in the mind alone, the guesses should land above chance, more often than not, across enough trials to matter. The idea has a long history, longer than most people realize. Some of the earliest documented attempts go back to the late 1800s, when a wave of interest in unusual mental phenomena was sweeping through certain corners of science, alongside a great deal of enthusiasm that wasn't always matched by careful method. Early results were often striking. People seemed to guess correctly far more than they should have. But almost every one of those early studies had a problem, and often more than one, and the problems are worth walking through slowly, because they explain a great deal about why this remains, even now, one of the more contested corners of psychology. The first problem is the simplest, and it's one you've probably already guessed. Expectation shapes perception more than most people appreciate. If you're sitting in a chair, believing that someone is behind you and might be staring, your body doesn't stay neutral while it waits. Attention itself produces sensation. A faint prickling at the back of the neck can show up simply because you're paying close attention to the back of your neck. The way a sound in a quiet house seems louder the moment you start listening for it. In the earliest staring studies, participants often knew, in general terms, what the experiment was testing. They knew someone might be looking at them. That knowledge alone was enough to generate a baseline hum of alertness that had nothing to do with whether the staring, in that particular moment, was actually happening. The second problem sits inside the design of the studies themselves, and here, the details matter more than they might seem to. In many early experiments, the same person decided when to stare and when to look away, then recorded whether the guess was correct, often without anyone checking the sequence of stares against the sequence of guesses for accidental patterns. A person choosing when to stare, even while trying hard to be random, tends not to be very random at all. People fall into rhythms. They alternate more than true chance would predict, or they cluster certain choices together without meaning to, the same way someone asked to write down a random string of coin flips will almost always produce a string that looks less random than an actual coin. If the person doing the staring has unconscious patterns, and the person guessing has even a faint, unconscious sense of those patterns, built up over the course of many trials, the results can drift above chance, without anything paranormal occurring at all. It's simply two nervous systems, both imperfect, both leaking small cues into a supposedly sealed situation. That leakage is the third problem, and it deserves its own moment, because it's easy to underestimate how many channels exist between two people in the same room, even when they can't see each other. Sound is one of the quietest culprits. A chair creaking as someone leans forward to stare. A change in breathing rhythm, breath held slightly during concentration, released when attention relaxes. The faint sound of clothing shifting. In some early studies, the two participants were in the same room, with only a screen or a turned back between them, and under those conditions, tiny auditory cues can travel more information than anyone intends. Later studies tried to close this gap by putting the starer and the guesser in separate rooms entirely, sometimes with the staring delivered through a video link or a one-way mirror rather than in person, precisely to remove the possibility of sound, temperature change, or subtle vibration passing between them. When those tighter controls were added, the striking results from the earlier decades tended to shrink, not always to nothing, but often close to it, and always toward something far less dramatic than the original claim suggested. There's a fourth issue, quieter than the others, but just as important, and it has to do with what gets published and what gets remembered. Throughout the history of science,
There's been a persistent tendency, not unique to this topic at all, for exciting positive results to travel further and get repeated more often than careful null results, the kind that simply find nothing unusual going on. A study that reports a surprising effect tends to get cited in later work, discussed in books, brought up in conversation. A study that repeats the same design carefully and finds no effect beyond chance often just sits quietly in a journal, doing very little to change the public sense of the topic. Over the decades, this creates something like an optical illusion in the scientific record itself. It isn't that no one ever tested the idea and found nothing. Plenty did. It's that the finding of nothing is far less memorable, and so the balance of what most people have heard about ends up tilted toward the studies that felt, and were designed, less carefully. None of this means the entire history of research on this topic can be waved away as pure error, and it would be a little dishonest to pretend otherwise. There have been well-run trials, some conducted decades apart, in different countries, using proper double-blind procedures, where the sequence of staring and not staring was generated by a machine rather than a person, sealed from both participants until the study ended, and where the guesser and the starer had no shared sensory channel at all. Some of these have reported results just slightly above what pure chance would predict. Small effects, but statistically present, according to the numbers reported. This is where things get genuinely difficult, in the honest, unresolved way that real open questions in science often are. A small effect that keeps showing up, even faintly, across careful studies, deserves attention, rather than dismissal. But a small effect is also exactly the kind of result most vulnerable to subtle errors in method, to slight biases in how trials were selected for analysis, to the ordinary statistical noise that appears whenever enough experiments are run, and only some of them get discussed afterward. This is where the idea of replication becomes so central, and it's worth sitting with for a moment, because it explains something important about how science actually works, as opposed to how it's sometimes imagined to work. A single study, however careful, however well designed, is not usually treated by scientists as proof of anything. It's treated as a data point, one result among many, that eventually need to be assembled into a pattern. The real test of an effect isn't whether it appeared once under good conditions, but whether independent researchers, working separately, using their own equipment and their own participants, can produce something similar again and again. For the sense of being watched, this replication has been attempted more than once, by different research groups, with mixed and sometimes contradictory outcomes. Some analyses that pooled many small studies together found a modest effect that seemed to survive scrutiny. Other researchers, looking at the same body of work with different statistical tools, or attempting new trials of their own with even tighter controls, found the effect shrink toward nothing, or vanish outright. That kind of disagreement, rather than being a failure of the process, is really the process working the way it's supposed to. It's how a claim gets tested from every angle before anyone is entitled to call it settled. What all of this leaves us with is not a clean yes or a clean no, and it's worth resisting the urge, which is a very human urge, to want the story to resolve neatly before drifting off. What it leaves us with is a much more interesting and more honest picture, one where a widely shared, deeply persistent human feeling turns out to sit at the crossing point of several separate things at once. There is a real, fast, ancient system in the brain, built specifically to detect eyes and gaze direction, and that system fires readily, sometimes on the thinnest of cues. There is the ordinary amplifying effect of expectation and attention, which can manufacture sensation out of nothing more than a suspicion. There is the long, complicated history of experiments trying to separate the two, a history full of good intentions, imperfect designs, and results that have never fully settled into agreement. And there is, running underneath all of it, a much older and quieter kind of biology, the kind that doesn't care about certainty at all, because it evolved long before anyone thought to ask whether the feeling was justified.
Let's think for a moment about what happens after the feeling passes. You're sitting on a train, and a prickle runs up the back of your neck, and you turn, and there, 2 rows back, someone's eyes are actually on you. Just for a second. They look away, a little embarrassed, and you look away too, and something in your chest settles into a kind of quiet satisfaction. See, I knew it. That one moment gets to live on. It becomes a story you might tell later, almost without meaning to. This weird thing happened on the train today. It gets filed away, polished a little each time it's retold, until it feels like solid evidence of something. But think about the rest of that train ride. Think about every other moment on it, the times you felt nothing at all, and there was, in fact, someone glancing at you from across the aisle, maybe checking the time on your phone, maybe just letting their gaze drift past you, the way eyes drift past everything in a moving train car. Those moments don't become stories. They don't get filed away. They don't even register as moments, really, because nothing happened that felt worth noticing. And then think about the opposite case, just as common, if not more so. The times you did feel that prickle, that sense of being observed, and turned around to find absolutely nothing. No eyes, no one paying you any attention at all, just an empty seat, or a stranger looking at their book, or a window with your own faint reflection in it. What happens to that moment? It usually just dissolves. It doesn't get retold at dinner. It doesn't even get remembered by the time you've reached your stop. It was a false alarm, and false alarms, by their nature, are forgettable, because nothing about them confirms anything. This is worth sitting with for a while, because it's not a small detail. It might be one of the most important pieces of the whole puzzle, and it has almost nothing to do with any special sense, and almost everything to do with how memory quietly does its work, while we're not paying attention to it doing so. Picture, for a moment, someone standing at a slot machine. Not to make any particular point about gambling, just because it's such a familiar, well-studied piece of human behavior. Every pull of the lever, in the old mechanical machines, in the newer ones too, mostly returns nothing, or close to nothing. Coins clatter faintly, lights flicker, the reels spin and land on losing combinations, and after a while, all those small failures blur together into a kind of background hum that barely registers at all. But every so often, coins spill out, lights flash, a small bell rings, and that moment stands apart from everything around it. It gets noticed. It gets remembered. It might even get talked about later, at home, at work. The story of the time the machine paid out, the 1,000 quiet losses that came before it, don't get a story. They just get absorbed into the general sense that, well, sometimes you win. The feeling of being watched works in something like the same way, except the machine, here, is your own nervous system, quietly running detection checks all day long, mostly returning nothing, and once in a while returning a hit. The hits are memorable, the misses are not. And because memory is doing the sorting after the fact, keeping the vivid confirmations and letting the uneventful non-events slip away unrecorded, what's left over, when you try to recall your own history with this feeling, is a lopsided collection. It looks, from the inside, like the feeling is almost always right.
But that impression isn't built from a fair sample of every time the feeling occurred. It's built from the tiny slice of times it happened to line up with something, remembered vividly, sitting right next to a much larger, much quieter pile of times it didn't, remembered barely at all, if it's remembered at all. There's a related trick memory plays, a close cousin of this one, and it has to do with the order in which things seem to happen once you're looking back at them. Say you feel that prickle, that sense of eyes on you, and a few seconds later someone does walk into the room, someone you hadn't noticed approaching. In the moment, and even more so afterward, it can feel as though the feeling arrived first, and the person arrived second, as though the feeling somehow anticipated them. But feelings and their sources aren't always laid down in memory, in perfectly ordered file folders, one before the other, time-stamped and clean. Memory reconstructs. It smooths things over. It's entirely possible, more than possible, that some faint sound, a floorboard, a change in air pressure as a door opened somewhere else in the house, a shift in the pattern of light under a doorway, reached your senses just slightly before you were consciously aware of it, and that faint signal is what triggered the prickle in the first place, with the conscious, someone's here, feeling, and the actual appearance of the person arriving so close together that the mind, tidying up the story afterward, quietly reshuffles them into a more satisfying order, cause before effect, feeling before confirmation. It feels eerie, precisely because the true order, the messier order, has been smoothed away by the very same memory that's trying to make sense of what happened. None of this requires anyone to have been careless, or foolish, or overly credulous. This is simply what memory does, for everyone, all the time, in matters far less strange than a sense of unseen eyes. Ask anyone who has ever thought about buying a particular kind of car, a certain make and color, only to suddenly start seeing that exact car everywhere, on every street, in every parking lot, as though the world had conspired to fill itself with them overnight. The world didn't change. The cars were there all along, the same modest fraction of the traffic as ever. What changed was attention. The mind started tagging examples that matched the new category of interest, and stopped discarding them, the way it discards nearly everything else that passes in front of the eyes, without being useful. It's the same quiet mechanism, just wearing a different, less unsettling costume. Coincidence plays its own part here too, and coincidence is a stranger, slipperier thing than most people give it credit for while they're awake and reasoning carefully, let alone while drifting toward sleep. Given enough chances, unlikely seeming alignments aren't actually unlikely at all. If you spend your days moving through rooms full of people, offices, cafes, buses, hallways, classrooms, you generate an enormous number of small opportunities every single day for a stray glance to land on you at roughly the moment some unrelated prickle of unease passes through your body, perhaps because you were tired, or cold, or your shirt collar shifted against your neck, or a draft moved through the room. Most of these near misses go entirely unremarked, but every so often, purely by the ordinary math of many trials, one of them lines up in a way that feels too precise to be chance. It isn't that the laws of coincidence were suspended for you specifically, it's that you were bound, sooner or later, simply by living an ordinary life full of ordinary encounters, to experience an alignment vivid enough to remember, the same way that anyone who plays enough hands of cards will eventually be dealt a hand worth talking about.
None of this is offered to take the feeling away from you, or to suggest that what you noticed on that train, or in that hallway, or in that quiet room at night wasn't real in the sense of actually happening. The prickle was real. The turn of the head was real. What's being gently unpacked here is something else, something a little more delicate. Not whether the feeling occurred, but why certain occurrences of it feel so much more convincing, in hindsight, than the full, honest record would support. The mind is not a neutral court reporter taking down every event in equal detail for later review. It's an editor, and like any editor, it has a sense of what makes a good story, and it quietly leaves the boring parts on the cutting room floor. So the picture that emerges isn't one of a mind fooling itself out of nothing, spinning eerie sensations from thin air for no reason at all. It's closer to a mind that is genuinely, actively sensing something, some faint signal, some flicker of movement, some old evolutionary tripwire, but then handing that raw sensing over to a second system, a storytelling system, whose job is to stitch experiences into a coherent narrative rather than a statistically balanced one. And once you start looking at it that way, a new question opens up quite naturally, one that has less to do with ghosts or gaze detection and much more to do with the strange, layered architecture of the brain itself, and how something built for one purpose can end up doing another job entirely, almost by accident, in the dark. There's a detail worth sitting with before we go further into the machinery itself, and it's this. The feeling of being watched is not a fixed quantity. It doesn't sit at the same volume all the time, waiting to be triggered by the same fixed amount of ambiguous input. It rises and falls, sometimes dramatically, depending on the state of the person doing the sensing. The exact same rustle of leaves, the exact same shadow crossing a window, can mean almost nothing to you on a bright, unhurried afternoon, and can feel like a hand closing around your spine on a night when you are anxious, or alone, or simply very, very tired. The stimulus hasn't changed. You have. This is worth pausing on, because it reframes the whole question in a useful way. If the feeling of being watched were purely a matter of external evidence, purely a readout of some genuine signal in the environment, then it should be roughly consistent. A faint sound behind you should produce a faint sense of unease, no matter what kind of day you've had. But it doesn't work that way, and the reason it doesn't is that the brain is never just processing the world in isolation. It's processing the world through the lens of its own internal state, and that internal state acts less like a neutral filter and more like a set of adjustable dials, turning the gain up or down on how much meaning gets extracted from the same raw material. Think of it the way a smoke detector works. A good smoke detector is calibrated to a certain threshold of particles in the air before it sounds an alarm. But that threshold isn't always the same in every context. Put the same detector in a kitchen where someone is cooking bacon, and it might be tuned, deliberately or not, to be a little less twitchy, because a bit of smoke is expected and constant alarms would be exhausting and useless. Now imagine the opposite, a building that has just had a fire, or a family that has just lost a home to one. Suddenly, every faint whiff of something burning, even something as ordinary as toast, sets off not just the detector, but a wave of very real, very physical alarm in the people living there. The smoke hasn't changed. The threshold has. Anxiety works on the brain's threat detection systems in something like this way. When a person is anxious, whether from a specific worry or from a more general, free-floating unease that doesn't have a clear source,
the nervous system tends to lower its threshold for what counts as a potential threat. This isn't a character flaw or a sign of weakness. It's closer to a setting, an adjustment that evolution seems to have favored, because in a genuinely dangerous environment, a nervous system that reacts a little too readily to ambiguous signals is safer, on average, than one that waits for certainty before responding. Better to flinch at 100 harmless shadows than to calmly ignore the one shadow that actually mattered. But the cost of that safety margin is a kind of noise. An anxious mind, primed to expect threat, will find candidates for threat more easily, will notice the half-glimpsed movement, the sound that doesn't quite fit, the feeling that eyes are somewhere nearby, even when nothing in particular is actually there. Hypervigilance takes this a step further, and it's worth being gentle and precise about what that word means, because it isn't simply another word for worry. Hypervigilance describes a state where attention itself has been reorganized around scanning for danger, sometimes as a lasting pattern that develops after a person has lived through something frightening or unpredictable, sometimes as a more temporary state brought on by a stretch of stress or poor sleep. In this state, the senses aren't passively waiting to be alerted. They're actively searching, sweeping the environment the way a lighthouse beam sweeps the water, and a mind that is actively searching for something will, sooner or later, find something to land on, because ambiguity is everywhere if you look closely enough. A creak in an old house, a flicker at the edge of a screen, the sensation of pressure on the back of the neck. None of these are unusual on their own, but to a hypervigilant mind, they arrive already flagged as significant, already halfway interpreted before conscious thought even catches up. Loneliness adds its own particular texture to this picture, and in some ways, it's one of the more surprising pieces, because on the surface, loneliness might seem like the opposite of feeling watched. If no one else is around, why would the sense of another presence intensify rather than fade? But researchers who study social cognition have noted, again and again, that human beings seem to be built with a deep, almost structural need for other minds nearby, for the sense that they exist within a web of attention and relationship. When that web is missing for too long, the mind doesn't simply accept the absence quietly. It seems to search for substitutes, and it's remarkably good at finding them. People who are isolated for extended periods, whether by circumstance or by more prolonged solitude, sometimes report a heightened sense of presence in empty rooms, a feeling that someone or something is nearby even when every rational assessment says otherwise. It's as if the machinery built for detecting other minds, having gone too long without real input, begins to generate faint signals of its own, the way a radio, left on too long in a dead zone, will eventually produce static, and, if you listen long enough, something that almost sounds like a voice.
Darkness plays its own well-documented role, and this one is less mysterious, though no less powerful for being explainable. In darkness, the eyes, which normally supply the majority of information about the surrounding space, become far less reliable. The visual system, deprived of its usual clarity, doesn't simply go quiet. It often becomes more active in its guessing, filling gaps with expectation, and human beings have spent a very long evolutionary stretch of time in environments where the dark genuinely did contain more danger than the daylight did. Nocturnal predators, unlit terrain, the simple loss of the early warning that daylight vision provides. All of this shaped a nervous system that treats darkness as a context demanding extra caution. So it should come as no surprise that the feeling of being watched is reported far more often after sunset than during the day, not because ghosts prefer the evening shift, but because the very same ambiguous input, a sound, a shape, a flicker, is processed by a system that has already, quietly, turned its threat sensitivity up several notches simply because the lights are off. Unfamiliar places compound all of this in their own way. In a space you know well, your own bedroom, a childhood home, a route you've walked 1,000 times, your brain has an enormous library of expectations to draw on. It knows where the pipes are that make that particular knocking sound. It knows which floorboard always creaks near the window. In an unfamiliar place, that library is empty, or nearly so, and every sound, every shift of light, arrives without a comfortable explanation already attached to it. The mind has to work harder to categorize what it's experiencing, and while it works, in that gap between sensation and explanation, feelings of unease have more room to take hold. Crowds, interestingly, produce something of the opposite effect from loneliness, but land in a similarly charged place. In a crowd, the odds that someone, somewhere, actually is glancing in your direction rise enormously, simply as a matter of numbers, and the brain's gaze detection systems, tuned as they are to catch even brief and peripheral eye contact, have far more raw material to work with. Add self-consciousness to that mix, the very ordinary human tendency to imagine oneself as more noticed than one usually is, and a crowded room or a crowded train can produce its own steady hum of watchedness, less eerie than the empty hallway version perhaps, but built from many of the same underlying parts. And then there is fatigue, which threads through nearly all of these other conditions and quietly amplifies each of them. A tired brain is a brain with fewer resources available for careful, deliberate interpretation. The kind of slow, effortful reasoning that might otherwise step in and say, "That was probably just the wind," or "That was probably just a reflection," becomes harder to summon when a person is exhausted. In its place, quicker, more instinctive judgments take over, almost by default, and those instinctive judgments tend to lean toward caution rather than calm. This is one small reason, among several, that strange sensations so often seem to visit people, specifically at the edges of sleep, in that soft, unguarded territory where the deliberate, editing mind has begun to loosen its grip, and something older and faster is left, for a little while, in charge of making sense of the dark. Now consider a different kind of watching, one that would have made no sense at all to explain to someone living even 200 years ago. Today, a person can sit alone in a quiet room, certain that no one else is physically present, and still be seen. A laptop camera sits above the screen like a small dark eye. A phone rests nearby, capable, in principle, of listening. Somewhere on a shelf, a smart speaker waits for a word it might or might not have already half heard. None of these devices needs a person standing behind them, breathing, shifting weight from foot to foot. And yet the feeling they can produce, that faint, prickling sense of being observed, draws on exactly the same old machinery built for detecting a hidden animal in the grass. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it marks something genuinely new in the long history of human wariness. For almost all of that history, The feeling of being watched was, whatever its accuracy in any single instance, at least aimed at the right general category of threat. Something with eyes, something with intentions, something that could choose to approach or choose to stay hidden. A perceptual system built for that world now finds itself, every day, in a world where the watching, when it happens at all, often has no eyes attached to it whatsoever. A camera does not look at someone the way a person looks at someone. It has no gaze to avert, no attention to wander, no boredom that might make it glance away. It simply records, indifferently, whether anyone is paying attention to the recording or not. But the brain, meeting that little dark lens, still sometimes responds as though something is behind it, watching back, because that is the only interpretive framework it has ever really had to work with. Cameras in public spaces complicate this further, because unlike a hidden predator, they are often visible on purpose. A small sign, near a shop entrance, a dome, mounted at a street corner, a lens, tucked into the corner of a ceiling, above a row of shelves. These are meant to be noticed, at least a little, both as a practical deterrent and as a kind of quiet announcement. This space is being kept an eye on, and people do notice them, though often only at the edges of awareness. Someone might walk past a camera on a familiar street 100 times without a single conscious thought about it, and then, on the 101st walk, catch its outline against the sky in a certain slant of afternoon light, and feel, briefly, a small jolt of self-consciousness. Nothing about the camera has changed. What has changed is simply that the mind, for a moment, has actually registered it, rather than filing it away, automatically, as part of the unremarkable furniture of the street. There is also something worth noticing in how differently this modern, technological form of being watched sits in the body compared with the older, animal version. The eerie prickle down the neck, the hair lifting slightly on the arms, the specific bodily alarm tuned to a living gaze. These tend not to fire nearly as strongly for a camera as they do for the sense of an actual person nearby. A camera can produce discomfort, certainly, and even a kind of low, persistent unease if someone is particularly conscious of it, but it rarely produces that same electric, animal jolt. This gap is a small, but telling clue about how old and how specific the underlying detection system actually is. It was not built, and could not have been built, with lenses and sensors in mind. It was built for eyes set into a face, attached to a body, capable of movement and intention. Everything else gets processed through that same old channel, but often more faintly, more intellectually, more like a thought about being seen than a felt sense of it. Mirrors offer a strange and almost opposite kind of case, because a mirror produces the visual signature of a watching face without any separate watcher behind it at all. Anyone who has caught a glimpse of their own reflection unexpectedly, in a dim hallway or a darkened window at night, in a moment where they had not been thinking about mirrors or reflections, knows the small flinch that can follow. For a fraction of a second, before recognition catches up, the visual system has registered a face, a pair of eyes, apparently looking directly back. That first fraction of a second is not foolish or embarrassing, even though it produces, afterward, a slightly sheepish laugh. It is simply the gaze detection system doing exactly what it evolved to do, responding to the pattern of a face before the slower, more deliberate parts of the brain
have had time to add the correcting information. That is a mirror. That is glass and silver backing. That is only me. Old houses with many mirrors, positioned at odd angles in stairwells and along the ends of corridors, produce this effect often enough that a certain kind of nervous alertness around unexpected reflections shows up again and again in personal accounts from people who grew up in such houses, particularly when moving through them by candlelight or lamplight, when a face could seem to swim up out of near darkness with very little warning.
Then there is a form of watching that is neither a device with a lens nor a trick of reflected light, but something more diffuse, the modern, low-grade awareness that a great deal of ordinary activity is, in some sense, recorded or logged somewhere, even when no one is looking at it in any given moment. A purchase leaves a record. A search leaves a trace. A location can sometimes be inferred from a phone that never leaves a pocket. This is a real and reasonable subject for concern, and it deserves to be thought about carefully, in daylight, with a clear head, weighing actual risks against actual protections in a way that a bedtime story is not the right place to resolve. But it is worth noticing that this kind of concern, however legitimate, tends to feel different in the body than the sudden, wordless sense of being watched right now, in this room, by something with eyes. The first is a conclusion, arrived at through reasoning about how systems and companies and data work. The second is a raw, immediate signal, arriving without any argument behind it at all, sometimes correct and sometimes not, but always delivered in the same old urgent language of eyes and attention and nearness. Separating these two experiences from each other is a genuinely useful thing to practice, especially late at night, when the mind is less inclined to draw fine distinctions and more inclined to let one kind of unease blur into another. A person lying in bed, phone dark on the nightstand, camera cover perhaps closed out of ordinary caution, can still feel that old prickle on the back of the neck, and it is worth remembering, gently, that this feeling did not arrive by way of any actual evidence about cameras or data or anyone's real attention. It arrived by way of a much older channel, the same one that once scanned tall grass and shadowed thickets, now firing in response to darkness, stillness, and the ordinary uncertainty of a quiet room. The concern about surveillance, when it is warranted, tends to sound like a sentence. Someone could be watching, given what is technically possible. The bodily sense of being watched, by contrast, tends not to arrive as a sentence at all. It arrives as a feeling first, complete with its own private certainty, and only afterward, if at all, does the mind go looking for a reason to attach to it. Understanding this difference does not make either experience disappear, and there is no need for it to. The goal is not to argue oneself out of noticing a camera, or to pretend that reasonable questions about privacy do not deserve real attention in the daylight hours. The goal, if there is one worth naming at all here, is simply to let the body's old alarm be recognized for what it is when it shows up uninvited at night. Not a verdict, not a discovery, but an old and slightly outdated messenger, still delivering warnings in the only language it has ever known, even now, in bedrooms full of quiet electronics that neither look nor care nor mean anything at all by simply sitting there, dark and silent, on a shelf across the room. There is one more layer to this modern watchfulness worth turning toward, before sleep settles further in.
and it has less to do with devices than with other people, and the strange, particular unease that can arise from being watched not by chance but by design.
So let's turn, gently, to what can actually be done with this feeling when it arrives, because there are a few small, quiet tests that the body seems to trust more than any amount of reasoning offered to it from the outside. The first of these is simply to pause, not to react, not to sit bolt upright and scan the room like a sentry, but to pause the way a person might pause with a hand on a doorknob, listening for something before turning it. A pause of even a few seconds changes the quality of attention. The nervous system, when it first raises the alarm, tends to want speed, a fast decision, fight or flee or freeze, because that is what it was built for, out on some ancient hillside where hesitation could cost something real. But there is no hillside here. There is a room and a bed, and a few seconds of stillness costs nothing at all. In that pause, it becomes possible to ask a very simple question, the kind a careful person might ask themselves before anything else. What, exactly, am I sensing right now? Not what am I afraid of, not what could be true, but what, specifically, is arriving through the actual senses in this actual moment. This question tends to be more useful than it sounds, because the feeling of being watched so often travels without any specific sensory cargo attached to it. It is a mood, a pressure, a generalized tightening, and when a person goes looking for the particular sound, or sight, or touch that supposedly caused it, there is frequently nothing there to find. Not because nothing is happening, but because the feeling arrived first, and the search for evidence came second, which is, as earlier parts of this long unwinding thought have already suggested, the usual order of operations for a mind built to react before it explains. So the useful move is not to assume the sensation is either fully true or fully false, but to treat it briefly, like a scientist might treat an unexplained reading on an instrument, with a kind of unhurried curiosity. Is there a sound? Is it a draft finding a gap under the door, or the particular tick of a house cooling after a warm day, wood and pipe contracting in their slow, ordinary way? Is there a smell, faint and unfamiliar, or is it simply the smell of one's own room, so constant that it usually goes unnoticed until attention happens to land on it? Naming these things, even silently, even without moving, tends to loosen the grip of the feeling a little, the way turning on a single small lamp in a dark house can make the whole space feel different, not because the darkness beyond the lamp has changed, but because the mind now has one steady point of reference to hold on to. A second gentle test involves changing the viewpoint, quite literally. Much of the unease tied to feeling watched depends on a fixed angle, one direction faced, one patch of darkness left unseen behind a shoulder or beyond a half-open door. Sailors on long night watches, centuries ago, learned this without any need for a name for it, developing the habit of a slow rotation, eyes moving in an unhurried arc across the horizon, rather than fixing on one shadowed patch of sea and letting the imagination do the rest of the work uncontested. The same habit translates easily enough to a bedroom, a slow, calm turn of the head, not a startled whip around, but an easy, almost lazy sweep of the eyes across the room, tends to do more to settle the nervous system than any amount of lying rigid and staring at the ceiling, bracing for something to resolve itself out of the corner of one's eye. The brain, remember, from earlier in this account, is a prediction machine, filling in gaps with whatever seems most likely, given very little information,
and a fixed, narrow field of vision gives it far too many gaps to fill. A wider, calmer sweep gives it less room to invent. Reflections deserve a small mention of their own here, since mirrors and dark windows have a very particular talent for manufacturing the feeling of being watched out of nothing at all. A darkened window at night becomes, for practical purposes, a kind of imperfect mirror, especially with a lamp lit somewhere in the room behind the person looking at it, and the shape reflected back, softened by glass and distance and the unevenness of old panes, can very easily read as a second presence standing just where no one is standing.
This has startled people for as long as there has been glass to be startled by, and it startled people before glass too, in the wavering reflection of water in a basin, or the dim gleam of polished metal, any surface capable of throwing an imperfect version of the world back at itself. Checking this is almost embarrassingly simple once remembered. A hand raised, a slight turn of the head, watching whether the reflected shape moves in the same instant, in the same way. It always does, of course, because it was never anything but a reflection, but the checking itself matters more than the obvious answer, because it gives the alarmed part of the mind the concrete evidence it was quietly asking for all along. Breath belongs in this list too, not as some separate wellness instruction bolted onto the end, but because breath and the sense of threat are so tightly wound together that one cannot really be addressed without touching the other. A held breath, shallow and high in the chest, is itself a kind of confirmation to the nervous system that danger is present, a physical vote cast before any decision has been consciously made. Slowing the breath, lengthening the exhale in particular, sends the opposite vote, an old and reliable one, understood by the body long before it was ever explained by any physiologist with instruments and diagrams. A slow count in, 4 perhaps, and a slower count out, 6 or 7, repeated without any urgency behind it, tends to do more to quiet a false alarm than almost anything else available in a dark room at an inconvenient hour. This is not a claim that breath makes danger disappear when danger is real. It is a much smaller and more honest claim that breath changes what the body is prepared to believe about the moment it is in, and that a body no longer voting for danger tends to loosen its grip on a feeling that had little evidence behind it in the first place. And after the pause, the sweep, the check of any reflection, the slowed breath, there is one more habit worth folding in gently, which is the ordinary act of reaching first for the ordinary explanation. Not because ordinary explanations are always correct, but because they are, overwhelmingly, across the long run of nights and rooms and startled moments that make up a human life, the ones that turn out to be true. A sound is very often a house settling, or a pipe, or a neighbor's late footstep through a shared wall, or a cat somewhere doing whatever cats do at 3 in the morning. A shape in the dark is very often a coat on a hook, a chair at an unfamiliar angle, a shadow cast by a street lamp, shifting as a branch moves outside. This is not a dismissal of the feeling, but a kind of respectful triage, giving the mundane explanation its fair first hearing, before reaching for anything stranger. The same courtesy a careful investigator might extend to the simplest theory, before entertaining the more elaborate one. All of this said, gently, and without any wish to alarm, it remains worth naming plainly that there are times when unease is not old wiring misfiring in an empty room, but an accurate reading of an actual situation, and no amount of slow breathing or reflective checking is meant to argue a person out of trusting that. If a sound repeats with a pattern that does not match wind or pipes or houses settling, if a door is found open that was closed,
If a specific and concrete reason for concern is present, rather than only a feeling, the appropriate response is not more breathing but action, checking locks, turning on lights, calling someone, trusting the same instincts that, in the great majority of ordinary nights, turn out to have been reacting to nothing at all. The old alarm system, after all, was never wrong to exist. It has simply, on most quiet nights in most quiet rooms, run a little ahead of the evidence, and knowing how to gently catch up to it, rather than being dragged along behind it, tends to make all the difference between a moment of unease and a night lost entirely to it. With the body settled, and the room checked and found, as it so often is, to be exactly as harmless as it appeared before any of this began, there is still the matter of a much older kind of watching to consider, one that has nothing to do with houses or reflections at all, and everything to do with the sky.
So let the whole shape of it settle now, quietly, the way sand settles once the water stops moving. Nothing that has been said tonight was meant to explain the feeling away. It was meant to explain the feeling, which is a different and gentler project. The sense of being watched, when it arrives, is not a malfunction to be embarrassed about, and it is not proof of something standing behind the curtain either. It is closer to a weather report generated by a very old, very diligent department inside the brain, one whose only job, for longer than there have been words for jobs, has been to guess what might be paying attention to you before you have the chance to find out the hard way. That department does not wait for certainty. It was never built to. It was built to be a little too fast, a little too willing to raise a flag on a hunch, because across the long stretch of time that shaped it, the cost of a false alarm was a wasted glance, and the cost of a missed one could be much worse. So it kept its threshold low, generation after generation, and here it still is tonight, doing exactly what it was shaped to do, in a bedroom with the door locked and the phone dark on the nightstand. Prediction turned out to be at the center of nearly everything examined tonight. The brain, it seems, is less a camera quietly recording the world than a kind of forecaster, constantly issuing small guesses about what is about to happen next, and then quietly comparing those guesses against whatever arrives. Most of the time, the guess and the arrival match closely enough that nothing rises into awareness at all. The hallway looks the way the hallway always looks. The room sounds the way the room always sounds, and the forecast is confirmed so smoothly that the forecasting itself goes unnoticed. It is only when the guess and the arrival disagree, even slightly, that something is pushed up into conscious attention, tagged, in effect, with a small red flag that says, "Here is something the model did not expect." A feeling of being watched is very often exactly that flag, arriving before the mind has finished sorting out what triggered it. The eyes catch a flicker of motion at the edge of vision that the center of vision never confirms. The skin registers a change in air pressure from a door that was, in fact, only settling. Some quiet mismatch occurs between what was predicted and what arrived, and the forecaster raises its hand before it can fully explain itself, and what is felt is only the raised hand, not yet the reason for it. Social attention runs alongside that same forecasting system, and it deserves to be remembered gently here as its own thread. Human beings, across every culture and every age that has left a record, have organized an enormous amount of the brain's real estate around a single ongoing question, which is roughly this: who around me is paying attention, and to what? That question was never idle curiosity. In a small group, on an open plain, or later in a village, or later still in a crowded city street, knowing whether a particular gaze was friendly, or hostile, or simply distracted,
was often the most useful single piece of information a person could have.
So the machinery for detecting a face, and for detecting where that face is looking, developed to be extraordinarily sensitive, tuned to catch even the faintest suggestion of two eyes, arranged the way eyes are arranged, in the wallpaper, in the wood grain, in the dark gap between curtains. That sensitivity does not switch off simply because the room is empty. It keeps scanning out of habit, the way a lighthouse keeper might keep glancing toward the horizon even on a night when no ships were expected, because the glancing itself became the shape of the evening. And then there are the tiny cues, easy to underestimate and easy to forget once the immediate feeling has passed. A change in temperature near a wall that shares a chimney flue, a very faint, very low sound at the threshold of hearing, present in almost every room that is not perfectly, artificially silent, and rising just slightly above that threshold when attention turns toward it. A draft finding a gap around an old window frame. None of these things announce themselves clearly. They arrive as fragments, half-sensed, and the mind, which does not like an unfinished sentence, tends to complete the fragment with whatever explanation is closest at hand. And for a mind already primed by a long evolutionary history, to expect that closest explanation to be another set of eyes, watching sometimes becomes the completion it reaches for. Memory plays its part too, quieter than the others but no less real. A story read years ago, a film half-watched between the fingers, a single sentence overheard as a child and never quite forgotten, all of it settles somewhere and waits, and on certain nights, in certain kinds of dark, it surfaces again without asking permission, lending its shape to whatever the senses are currently offering. This is not imagination in the sense of something invented from nothing. It is memory, doing what memory does everywhere else in life, filling gaps with familiar material, the way a half-remembered melody gets finished in a hum, even when the actual next note has been forgotten. None of this makes the feeling any less real as a feeling. That distinction is worth holding on to gently as sleep comes closer. The unease that rises in a quiet room is a real event happening in a real nervous system, with a real pulse and a real prickling at the back of the neck, whether or not any hidden sense was involved, whether or not anything was truly out there in the dark. Explaining where a feeling comes from is not the same as declaring the feeling false. A shiver at a cold draft is not less cold for being explained. A flinch at a loud sound is not less startling for being understood in terms of the nervous system's wiring. In the same way, the sense of being watched can be fully, respectably explained by prediction and social wiring and tiny cues and memory, and still be, in the moment it arrives, completely genuine. There is something almost companionable in that thought, if it is allowed to be. The very same alertness that occasionally raises a false alarm in an empty room is the same alertness that, across an almost unimaginable stretch of time, kept enough ancestors alive long enough to eventually produce this particular person, lying in this particular bed, turning this particular thought over one more time before sleep. It is not a broken system. It is a cautious one, inherited whole, doing its old and patient work long after the world that shaped it has changed almost beyond recognition. It does not know that the door is locked unless it is told, gently and repeatedly, by a mind willing to check and report back. It does not know that the shadow is a coat unless the coat is looked at directly, in the light, and confirmed to be exactly what it always was. Once told, once shown, it tends to quiet down, the way a dog settles once it has been let out to check the yard
and found nothing there. So if the feeling rises once more tonight, small and familiar, there is no need to argue with it, and no need to be carried by it either. It can simply be noticed, named for what it most often is, a forecasting system, running a little ahead of its evidence, a social alarm still scanning out of old habit, a fragment of sound or memory, completing itself in a familiar shape, and then, gently, it can be set down. The room is the room, the house is the house, settling the way houses do. The dark is only the absence of light, patient and empty, and, on this particular night, entirely without incident. Let the shoulders soften now, and the jaw unclench, and the breath slow into that long, unhurried rhythm that belongs to sleep and to nothing else. Whatever watched, if anything ever truly did, was very often only the mind watching itself, curious and careful, exactly as it was built to be. Rest well,